Nice to have a small group tonight. That hopefully means that we can get a lot of your individual questions answered as well as working through the lesson. If you're looking for other opportunities to get some free LSAT prep, we offer a couple more. One of my favorite ones is that you are able to join a live LSAT class, session 1, for free. So you can, if you live in a major metropolitan area like DC and Los Angeles, we offer in-person classes. We also have online classes available anywhere throughout the country. And our first session is 3 hours. It focuses on logic games and logical reasoning, as well as kind of an overview of the LSAT and study strategy. So it's a great sort of meaty first lesson. And you can sign up for free on our website to try it out for session 1, no risk to you. We also have a really great resource called LSAT Interact, which is a series of interactive video lessons taught by our instructors. That's kind of the next best thing you can get to actually having a real live teacher. Both of those resources are available on our website, so you can check those out if you'd like after the free prep hour tonight. I see we have a couple more folks joining. Welcome. If you're just coming in, feel free to use the chat window. I'll say hello again so you'll see it blinking yellow or orange on your screen. Feel free to use the chat window to say hello, share your name, where you're from, where you're at in your LSAT study journey. Tonight's class will be interactive, so you'll have the opportunity to participate in some polls, and you'll also have the opportunity to chat in any questions or perhaps some answers in the chat window. So if at any time you have a question, feel free to put it in the chat window and I'll take a look just as soon as I can. All right, so tonight's lesson is going to be focused on reading comprehension, and we are going to be working through a comparative passage together. So I'll show you the passage in just a moment, but just to back up and give some context, there are, of course, always 4 passages on reading comprehension, and 1 in every 4 passages is going to be a comparative passage. A comparative passage is a passage that presents a point of view from 2 different authors. So you'll have a passage A that is written by one author, and then you'll also have a passage B that's written by a different author. And these 2 passages will typically center on a common topic or theme, but they may approach them in very different ways. So one possible approach is you might have the author of passage A has a radically different opposing viewpoint from the author of passage B, and one is going against the other. But that is actually a less common style of comparative passage than you might think, perhaps because that's what we might be expecting, and the LSAT really knows how to challenge us. So you might see also, for example, author A presents a particular opinion, and author B might present just some related background information, perhaps not even take a stand. You also might see author A presents one perspective and author B presents maybe not an opposing perspective, but kind of a twist on that perspective. So one of our big jobs when we're reading comparative passages is to try to figure out how author A and author B relate to each other. You can do that in the way that I was just demonstrating. Another tool that we often use is what we at Manhattan Prep call the scale. Which is just literally a scale like this. It's basically just an image that's meant to help you organize your thinking. The idea behind the scale is that you should have 2 perspectives emerging from your read of any reading comprehension passage. So we've got, we'll say, instead of perspectives, let's say like perspective 1. And then on the other side of the scale, perspective 2. These may or may not, again, be opposing opinions. They might just be kind of 2 sides of a coin or 2 ways of looking at things. But what you want to think about as you read is, what are those two perspectives? And the challenge in a comparative passage is to kind of draw out two perspectives that are threaded through both passages and figure out what is each author's stance on those perspectives. So perhaps author A endorses perspective 1, perhaps author B is neutral. Or perhaps author B endorses perspective 2. Maybe both authors endorse the same perspective, but from a slightly different angle or with different evidence. So I'm going to put up a passage in just a moment, and I'm going to give you about 3.5 minutes to read that passage. And I would encourage you to read with an eye towards what are the major perspectives being presented and how does each passage sort of link differently into the argument or those perspectives. All right, I'm going to hop off camera while the passage is up. For about 3.5 minutes. I'll let you know when time is up. I encourage you to take notes as you read, if that's something that you're planning to do on the actual LSAT. Here is your passage. Okay, that is 3.5 minutes. So I'm going to take a few minutes to talk through with you now how I might approach reading this passage. And I'm going to start just kind of with passage A and talk you through the things that I might notice or note down on paper or use the highlighter tool on my iPad to track as I go. So as I read passage A, I'm keeping my eyes open for a few big things. The most important thing that I'm looking out for are any opinions that the author presents, but I'm also looking out for any shifts throughout the passage that indicate the structure of the overall passage. How is this passage laid out? What is each portion of the passage doing? So I'll demonstrate to you as we walk through this passage together. So the passage starts off by giving a little bit of background information that there's this way that law enforcement agencies can nullify laws by declining to prosecute. And then the author jumps in with an opinion. This power appears to be exercised frequently and gives us a really nice sense of the structure and purpose of this passage. They come right out and say, I am going to tell you why. So if I'm taking notes on the first paragraph, it might be something along the lines of that you can nullify laws by not prosecuting, and then the author is going to tell us why in the next paragraph. So now I'm pretty clear both that the purpose of the introduction paragraph is to kind of give me this background information about this phenomenon that law enforcement agencies do sometimes. And now I also know the second paragraph is going to tell me why this thing happens. So as I read the second paragraph, I do notice a bit of a shift or a duality. So I'm told that on the one hand, that laws are almost always over-inclusive. And on the other hand, if we were to make them less over-inclusive, if they were precisely tailored, this would be prohibitive. It would allow a lot of loopholes. So I'm starting to see this sort of duality or tension emerge between making a law very inclusive and potentially risking forbidding some things that we didn't want to, or making it so specific that it allows for loopholes. So I'm marking those as kind of my two opinions. I've got this idea of a very specific law and this idea of a very over-inclusive law. The author seems to see some concerns with both. The author continues by telling us some of the problems with an over-inclusive law. So it's not seeming like there's a great solution here, but then the author jumps in at the end with another shift telling us, all right, there is actually this technique, discretionary non-enforcement, that can kind of solve this paradox. You can avoid being over-inclusive, but not have a bunch of loopholes. So the author, I'm going to mark this with an AO for author's opinion, seems to think discretionary non-enforcement solves both problems. And then we get this final paragraph where the author throws in a little bit of a twist, talking about the idea of capricious enforcement, and this possibility that perhaps the law enforcement agency is actually going to focus on the stuff that wasn't sort of meant to be in the law, the stuff that is sort of inadvertently brought in. But the author offers a very clear opinion on this, that this seems unlikely. So it's unlikely that we're going to have this capricious enforcement. The author says it can happen, it's not even rare, but it's not the central tendency, and gives us some reasons why. So I'm going to add for the author's opinion that within this discretionary non-enforcement, the author thinks that capricious enforcement is unlikely. Great. So I have a sense coming out of the first paragraph that I'm feeling like the scale is kind of, on the one hand, we have the possibility of using over-inclusive language. On the other hand, we have the possibility of under-inclusion with loopholes. The author seems to be taking the opinion that we'd prefer over-inclusive language with discretionary non-enforcement. Kind of the best possible outcome, it seems, according to author A. So I'm locking into passage B with kind of this structure in mind, wondering how author B is going to fit in. It is possible that author B will change the scale and that I'll walk out of the second passage thinking, oh, actually, I think there's a different structure to this scale. So let's check it out. Author B right away seems to be kind of bringing in a real world example. So when I see this shift from theory to a real world example, the big thing that I'm wondering is, how does this example fit with the theory? I'm anticipating that this example might be an example of an over-inclusive law with discretionary non-enforcement perhaps, or it also might be an example of an under-inclusive law. Maybe it's a little bit of both. So let's check it out. So I get this situation where all these people are paying their water bills late, and they're going to selectively cut the water to a few residents, targeting only high-income neighborhoods. So I'm thinking about, is this an example of like a very specific law with a bunch of loopholes, or like a very inclusive law? It sounds to me like it's an example of discretionary non-enforcement. They're choosing to enforce the law for some people by cutting their water, but they're not doing that for everyone. So right now I'm seeing, okay, it seems like there's this example of discretionary non-enforcement, but I don't know how author B feels about that yet. Author B comes in the next paragraph and kind of throws in this alternative solution. Well, why not just attach a lien to this property, and that will provide this incentive to keep up with your water obligations. But then author B throws in a possible problem. There's actually a loophole. So now we're seeing author B give an example of kind of the other side of this dilemma that sort of prevents that the debts that are not taxes from being subject to liens, and that ultimately means they can't do this with water charges. And then author B's solution is, okay, well, let's change the law. So author B seems to be in kind of an interesting place where they're not really that into discretionary non-enforcement. They're like, I think I have a better idea. But they also are finding that an under-inclusive law it does indeed have loopholes. So author B is almost kind of thinking outside the box, saying, let's change the language of the law to perfectly fit what we need. Let's see if we can find that middle ground in between this current over-inclusive law and this other current under-inclusive law to get a law that sort of fits exactly what we want. So a little bit of a surprising take from author B, but definitely connecting clearly back to passage A. And that's the big thing that we want to come away from our reading with, is this clear sense of how do passage A and passage B fit together within a broader argument or a broader conversation. So once I have this, I'm going to be moving into the questions, but first just a couple of quick practical notes. You'll notice that I both took notes and also did some highlighting. We typically encourage folks to kind of make a decision, one or the other, to either highlight or take notes during a reading comprehension passage, since it's difficult to do both. The scale that I wrote is typically something that I would be more focused on in my head rather than trying to actually write it out on paper during the test. I might jot down a couple of notes about it, but it probably wouldn't even be quite as extensive as the minimalist scale that I typed up here, because I just don't have a lot of time for that. So it's more of a thinking tool than something that I actually want to create on paper. All right, so once I've got a good read of the passage, I'm ready to head into the questions. We're going to be taking a look at 5 real questions that are attached to this passage one at a time. For each of the questions, I'll give you a little bit of time to solve the question and then pull in your answer. And then we'll chat about that question, both in terms of the specifics of the question, but also in terms of what does this question represent for comparative passages in general? What can we learn from it? So here comes your first question. Oops, I skipped it. Here we go. First question, I'm going to hop off the camera for about a minute and a half, and I'll put up a poll when your time is up. All right, that was about a minute and a half. I'm going to put up a poll, and you can go ahead and use that to let me know what you think the best answer is. Okay, thank you. All right, so let's talk a little bit about what type of question we're facing here. So this is what we call an identification question. These can come up on standard passages and comparative passages. What makes it an identification question is the use of this word explicitly. So identification questions will give you some indication that what is being asked for was stated directly in the text. They might say, according to the passage, or in this case, explicitly, and that helps you know you should be able to find this. This is basically a scavenger hunt. So the good thing about this is there's very little thinking involved. You just have to search. The bad thing about it is that that can take some time. So what we want to think about are some ways that we can make this process a bit more efficient. Now, it's hard to trust our memories when we've read so much complex information in a short amount of time in a high stress situation. But we can use our memories to kind of make some judgment calls on where to start our searching. So as we scan through these answer choices, we might think about it in a couple of ways. One is we can ask ourselves, well, do I remember reading that at all? Does it seem to sort of generally be more aligned with passage A or passage B in particular? Like perhaps it was just mentioned in one, but not the other. Or is this something that I have no memory of at all? If you have no memory of it at all, then you actually would want to not cross it out. If you have no memory of it at all, then you want to be kind of going back to confirm that that it wasn't just something that you glossed over. In this case, the correct answer ends up being answer choice C. And each of us might have gone back to look for different answer choices differently depending on how our memory served us on this question. When I think about the answer being loopholes, I know that I remember reading this in passage B. So if I remember it in one passage, that's kind of an indication, well, hey, let me check that, I know it's at least in one place. Let me check to see if it's in the other place. So I'm going to head over to passage A, and it jumps out at me right away just because it happens to be in parentheses here, loopholes. Now, again, this is that sort of scavenger hunt aspect. All they want is, was this mentioned? Like, literally, did they say it? I don't have to interpret why they said it or what message is conveying or any sort of inference about it. It's just, is it there? So answer choice C, loopholes, is the one that ends up being there in both passages and is the correct answer. Let me know if you have any questions about this one. You can send them to me in the chat. If not, we're going to move on to the next question from this passage. Here it is. I'll give you 1:30. Okay, that's 1:30. I will put up a poll. You can let me know what you think. Awesome, thank you. Okay, so this is a different type of question. This is what we would call an inference question. We know it's an inference question because it uses the language of inference. It says what can be inferred. This is a little bit less straightforward than identification questions, but ultimately our game plan is still to rely very heavily on evidence from the text. Our mindset on an inference question is that we want to be selecting the most provable answer choice, the answer choice that might hold up in a court of law. This is a great sort of classic LSAT inference question because it has a lot going on that's very characteristic of common wrong answers on inference questions. In particular, I'm going to draw your attention to a couple of them. One is an issue that we call degree, which means that perhaps the statement that's being mentioned is true or discussed in the text, but the way the answer choice is worded is a little bit stronger than the way that it's worded in the text. The other one that we're going to keep our eyes open for is an opposite interpretation, which means that the answer choice is an idea that's discussed in the text, but the author actually takes the opposite stance of that. Now, with inference questions on a comparative passage, it's really important to pay attention to the scope of the question. I'm told here that this is just from passage B. So I have to sort of completely block out everything I know about passage A and focus all my attention on passage B and use only that to do my process of elimination. So I'm going to start with answer choice A. Most water customers in the city are late paying their water bills. Anytime I see the word most on the LSAT, that is my starting point. It doesn't necessarily mean that this is the wrong answer, but it is a potential issue of degree. So I want to investigate that. Most is very literal on the LSAT. It always means 50% or more, and it needs to be something that I can verify and prove in the text. So it's talking about how many people are late paying the water bills. I'm going to think about where did I read that? Which I know was at the beginning of passage B. And I'm going to just go back and do a quick reread to see, did they actually say this was most people? I see the number, 231,000 are late, some by months, some by decades. That is all I see about the number of people who are late. So it doesn't seem to hold up. So after a quick verification from the text, I'm going to cross it off. I see the same word pop up again in answer choice B. Most of the residents with outstanding water bills are in the city's high-income neighborhoods. So again, I'm going to think about where did they discuss high-income neighborhoods? I know that was in paragraph 1. Let me do a quick reread and see, do they indicate that most of those residents, most of the residences that have these late water bills are from those neighborhoods? So it says they're going to cut the water to a few residences only in high-income neighborhoods to make examples of a few privileged residents who were stiffing this system. It doesn't really seem to say, though, whether most of the bills come from these neighborhoods. It just says they're only going to kind of go after those people. So it's possible that most of the late bills come from these high-income neighborhoods. It's also possible that there's just a few people there, but that just is who they're deciding to target for enforcement. So I don't think that the most holds up to scrutiny. So I'm going to go ahead and cross off answer choice B. I'm going to turn to C now. It is appropriate to turn off the water of high-income residents in the city who pay their water bills a few days late. Well, it seemed like the author of passage B was not really in favor of this plan. Because instead of supporting the plan, author B offered a different alternative and suggested that their alternative, if we change the law so that we could do it, it would be easier and politically smarter than shutting off people's water. So answer choice C sounds like a great example of an opposite interpretation. This idea of whether it's appropriate does come up, but C actually runs against the grain of what the author was thinking. If we look at C, in recent years, the city has rarely, if ever, turned off the water of customers who were late paying their water bills. Now, again, I have some big questions about the degree of this here, rarely, if ever. So I'm going to go back in the text to verify. It says that these people are late paying their bills, some by months and some by decades. That is a little bit of a time clue. Like if people have been late by decades, then it sounds like maybe the city hasn't been doing that much to enforce it over the decades. And now they have this plan, which sounds like it's kind of a new thing. So, you know, and they say that there's so much money that is now owed to the city in overdue bills and penalties. And you would imagine maybe some of that would have been collected if they had turned off the water. So I don't see airtight evidence of D, but I do see a little bit more evidence than I've seen so far for the other answer. So I'm going to keep going. E, the only reasonable solution to the problem of overdue water bills in the city is to enact a law that classifies water bills as taxes. So I do remember them talking about this. And it seems pretty spot on with the author, but I do have a concern about this word only. So I'm going to go back and see, is that indicated by the author? This is the only way. I see water charges are not taxes. Why not change the law? That doesn't quite sound like they're saying that's the only solution. They just say it's an easier and smarter solution than shutting off water. So I've got another issue of degree here with E. I'm going to cross it off. So by process of elimination, the only thing that I really have support for here is answer choice D. And this is kind of the game that you're playing on inferences. The answer choice that you select doesn't have to be something that is 100% provable and definitely true based on the text. It just has to be more provable than the other answer choices that you're looking at. So tackling an inference question effectively and efficiently is often going to involve this sort of combined arsenal of going back and finding strong support in the text, but also being really confident in your wrong answer characteristics and seeing those words jump out at you, words like most, only, so that you can go back to verify them. All right, please let me know if you have any questions in the chat. And in the meantime, we'll go ahead and move on and check out the next question for this passage. I'll give you a minute and a half again. Okay, I'm going to set up a poll. All right, awesome. Thank you. So this question is what I think of as a purpose of a detail question. So it's also kind of asking you to synthesize both passages. So it's sort of an overlap question as well. How can we sort of connect one passage to the other? So it starts by asking me about the word selectively in passage B, and I need to think about its role. That's what makes it a purpose of a detail question. What makes it an overlap question is that I then need to make it correspond to the role of a word in passage A. Now, I have to be careful here. This is not just a game of matching synonyms. I'm not just looking for a word that means the closest thing to selectively. I'm looking for a word that plays the same role. So in order to answer this question, I really need to look at the word selectively in context and sort of determine what role is it playing within the context of passage B. So if I go back to line 42, it tells me officials are planning to selectively cut the water to a few residences with outstanding bills to show they are serious about collecting those debts. So it sounds like when they're using the word selectively here, they're using it to describe that sort of discretionary non-enforcement of the law, where they sort of select only a few people to whom the law applies, or for whom they will enforce the law. They're selecting these just a few residences. So that's kind of what I have in mind is, it's this idea that they're just selecting a few to cut their water as I go into the answer choices. So I'm just going to check out each of these. The first one particularly, they tell me, is in line 12. And it says, the more particularly the legislature tries to describe the forbidden conduct. That sounds like they're saying kind of like the more specifically, which sounds a little different than like you're only selecting a few people. So I'm going to cross that one off. Probability in line 17. It would reduce the probability of acquitting a guilty one. That sounds like they're using it kind of to mean likelihood, which again feels a little different from they select only a few people. So I'm going to cross this off. Alternative in line 23. So it says the danger must be traded off against the costs of alternative methods that would reduce it. So that sounds like different methods, which again is a little different from selecting only a few people to whom the law applies. So I'm going to cross that one off. Discretionary in line 23. Discretionary non-enforcement, by which the cost of over-inclusion can be reduced without a corresponding increase in under-inclusion. Okay, so here I know from sort of earlier context from the first paragraph that this discretionary non-enforcement means that they are declining to prosecute certain violators. So the idea of discretionary means like they're making a choice. They're using their judgment or discretion to decide to whom the law applies. So that does sound a little bit like this idea of making a choice of a few people to whom the law is going to apply. So I'm going to keep that one. The last option is capricious in line 32. So it says capricious enforcement is not unknown, but it does not appear to be the central tendency. The agency doesn't stray too far from the intended regulation. So it sounds like capricious enforcement would be like getting really far away from the intention of the law. And again, that sounds a little bit different from this idea of just selecting a few people who did break the law. So I'm going to cross this off and select answer choice D. Again, the big takeaway here is in order to determine the best word to use, I need to first have a really clear sense of what the word in question was being used for in the initial context. I might even jot down on my notes what I think kind of that word was being used for to help me identify an appropriate match from the other passage. Okay, let me know if you have any questions in the chat. If not, we're going to move on to another question. Oops, here it is. Okay, that's a minute and a half. I'm going to launch a poll. Let me know what you think. All right, thank you. So this is a tough one. This asks us to sort of apply the opinion of one passage to the other passage. So a lot of inferring that's going on here. We're asked, oops, sorry, I switched questions on accident. We're asked to think about the plan described in passage B and what would the author in passage A have to say about it. So I'm going to check out the plan. Looks like it's this plan of selectively cutting off the water, targeting only high-income neighborhoods to make examples of a few privileged residents. So the best connection I can make back to passage A that I remember from my kind of initial passage map and scale was I remember thinking this sounded like an example of discretionary non-enforcement. They've got this sort of blanket law. A lot of people have broken it. They're choosing a few people to punish. So it might help me to go back into passage A and get some idea again of what author A thinks about discretionary non-enforcement. I can say that author A was generally positive about it. I can say that without even looking back. But I also might decide to go back and get a bit more specific. I might just take a quick sweep through the answer choices to see if this idea that it's discretionary non-enforcement and author A was generally positive about that can help me narrow it down. So A says officials should not implement the plan until just after the legislature's annual appropriations hearing. Okay, that's super negative, and I don't think author A would be super negative about this plan, so I'll cross it off. B, at least the plan would have a lower social cost than turning off all the water. Okay, that's kind of positive, so I'll keep it. C, the plan is a reasonable response. That's pretty positive, so I'll keep it. D, a better plan would have been to place liens on the property. That's like a pretty, I mean, it's got a positive word, better, but it's really ultimately kind of trashing this plan and saying, I think we've got a better idea. I don't know that author A would say that, so I'm going to cross this off. And then instead of implementing the plan, specific laws regarding the payment should be introduced. Again, this seems to be kind of providing an alternative, which is pretty negative, and it seems like author A was generally pretty positive about discretionary non-enforcement. So I'm going to go back and check into any support for B or C. B is about the social cost. C is about this being a reasonable response to a history of enforcing over-inclusive rules to the letter. Okay, so if I go back to passage A, and I'm looking for this idea of social cost, I see it right here in line 15. Enforcing an over-inclusive rule to the letter could impose very heavy social costs. So it seems kind of like they're saying like that is a potential problem with these very specific laws. And it is a problem that discretionary non-enforcement is trying to fix. It's trying to reduce the costs of over-inclusion, which are these very heavy social costs. So that's actually sounding pretty good for B, because author A does seem interested in having a lower social cost, which seems like that would be the case here. Let's check out C. So it's a reasonable response to the Water Department's history of enforcing over-inclusive laws to the letter. So does it talk anything about how history weighs in passage A? It doesn't really seem to. I wonder, did they actually say that the department has enforced over-inclusive rules to the letter? Well, they say that people have been like delinquent for decades. So it doesn't really sound like there is a history of over-enforcing these laws to the letter. It sounds kind of like the opposite. So this seems like, yes, maybe author A would think this plan is reasonable, but there's a little bit here in answer choice C of what we call detail creep, which is another wrong answer characteristic, which is the idea that part of an answer choice is accurate, but part of the answer choice gets a bit of the passage wrong. And in order to select an answer choice on reading comprehension, we really need the whole thing to be defensible, and only half of C is defensible. So that leaves me with only one possible correct answer, and that is answer choice B. I'll pause for a second and let me know if you have any questions about that. Okay, if not, let's take a look at our fifth and final question for this set of passages. Here it is. I'll give you a minute and a half. Okay, that's a minute and a half. I'm gonna send out another poll. All right, thank you. So the last question that we have here is another inference question. And this one is, again, focused on the use of language. So we're asked, what does an instance of capricious enforcement most likely involve? So what I really want to do here is get a strong, what we call pre-phrase, which is I need to go back to the text and get a really clear sense of what passage A says about capricious enforcement before I go into the answer choices. So I see capricious enforcement right here. So let me kind of read around it and see what clues I get. So I'm going to read before it first. So this is where they're talking about how discretionary non-enforcement does not determine the principle by which the law enforcement agency will select its cases. It could concentrate its resources on areas of conduct that had been brought inadvertently within the scope of the law. This is unlikely. So this seems like what they're describing as capricious enforcement, because then they say it's not unknown, but it does not appear to be the central tendency. So it's like one description of capricious enforcement is they sort of focus on like sort of inadvertent, or like a way I think about it is like the unintended aspects of the law. And then it goes on to say, legislative oversight assures that the agency does not stray too far from the intended as distinct from enacted regulation being enforced. Okay, so capricious enforcement doesn't happen because they don't stray far from the intended regulation. So it sounds like capricious enforcement would stray from the intended regulation. So I've got a lot of emphasis here on intention, and capricious enforcement is kind of going against or away from the intention of the law. So that's going to be my preface. So I'm going to go into the answer choices with that in mind. So answer choice A, enforcing the law only to the degree that municipal resources make possible. Well, there's nothing in here about resources, so I'm going to cross this off. B, enforcing the law according to the legislature's intent in passing the laws. So this sounds good because it does talk about intent, but what I got out of this paragraph was that it actually is kind of the opposite of that. It's that they focus on the unintended and they get away from the intended. So I'm going to cross this off, kind of an opposite answer. Prioritizing enforcement according to the amount of damage, that doesn't come up at all in this paragraph. Not understanding the difference between the letter of the law and the intent of the law. Again, I do see that idea of intent, but I don't see anything in the passage about not understanding. So I'm going to cross that off. Not following the intent of the legislature in enforcing the law. There's my answer. Focusing on the unintended aspects, straying from the intended regulation. So I'm going to select answer choice E. All right, so you all have now done an entire set of questions with a comparative passage. This is from practice test 68 if you're interested in checking it out in the future. If you would like some more work with us, check out our schedule of classes. It's available on our website. We have in-person classes in most major cities, and we also have online courses. You can try the first session of any of those for free. I'll stick around